Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us to the 11th annual CanQuick Conference, the Canadian Celebration of Women in Computing Conference. We're excited to have you here. Just a little bit of history. Well, actually, no, just a little bit of administration before we start, because once I get going, I'll forget to tell you this. If you have any questions or comments or questions for the speakers today, we'd like you to put them in the chat so that we can see them. Thank you. Also, the meeting is being recorded today, so we'll be posting that on our website when we're finished. So again, welcome to the CanQuick Conference. This is our 11th annual conference. The conference was founded in 2010. We ran it at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and it's gone on for the last 10 years to become a national conference. When we're in person, we would be all together having a great celebration with 750 people probably in attendance. So thanks for joining us here at our virtual conference. We're just trying to bridge the gap now between COVID times and the times that we can all be together again. Okay, first I'd like to introduce the team. So we have Adele Newton. She's the Executive Director of CSCAN InfoCan, and she's one of the key organizers of the conference. And we have Renata Rusiniak. Sorry, Renata, I didn't pronounce your name or practice pronouncing your name before this. She is our program coordinator, and myself is Wendy Powley. I'm a faculty member at Queen's University and the founder of the conference. We'd also like to thank the steering committee for their help in putting this together. They've been instrumental in coming up with the program and speakers for us, so thank you to all of them. We'd also like to thank our 2021 sponsor, EA Electronic Arts, and our partners ACMW and CSCAN InfoCan for their financial support and help putting the conference together. If you're looking for any work, which I assume that there's many of you out there, considering that this conference is largely attended by students, I'm sure that you're thinking about work, thinking about internships, summer jobs, full-time employment. We have a resume database that we're putting together. So if you're looking for work in any of these areas, looking for work in the technical field, upload your resume by tonight, midnight tonight, because I know you have nothing to do at midnight tonight, so you can do that when you're sitting around wondering what to do on a Friday night. We're putting all of these together into a package and passing them on to our many past sponsoring companies. So they're all looking for employees and would be happy to connect with you. You can upload your resume on the CanQuick website, which I've put there, the www.canquick.ca website. One of the offshoots of the CanQuick conference has been the Aspirations in Computing Awards. And what this program is for recognizing female identifying students in grades 9 to 12 for their accomplishments and interest and aptitude in computer science. They submit an application telling us what they've done, clubs that they've founded, competitions that they've been in, etc. And they go through an adjudication process and we come up with award winners across Canada. So if you know someone deserving of this award, we'd really like you to encourage them to apply. And the website's there to apply. If you have any questions, you can contact me and I can point you in the right direction. This program is run in conjunction with the NCWIT, which is the National Center of Women in Technology organization in the US. So we'd like to recognize our winners from last year. So the 2021, last year, this year winners are Alicia Bremer from St. Thomas More Collegiate in Coquitlam, BC, Maya Foster Thompson from Dartmouth High School in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, Ivy Guo from the Toronto District School Board Virtual Secondary School, and Nikki Guo from the same school in Toronto. So congratulations to our national winners this year. Okay, the agenda for the next couple of days. We've put together a lean but mean program for this year. Today we're going to have our keynote by Nadeshi Naidu, sorry, Nadeshi. And then we're going to have a Q&A session with DeepMind at 3:30 till 4:30, and the link is on the CanQuick website. If you'd like to join that session, they're looking to connect with potential employees. And tomorrow we have at noon the careers panel that we're going to talk to some academics and people out there in the field to find out what their days look like, what it's like to be in the field, etc. And then we have a closing keynote by Natalie Crosby at 1:30 tomorrow afternoon. So come and join us for all of our sessions in the next couple of days. So it's my pleasure to introduce Adeshni Naidu, and she is the head of engineering, legal practice, and productivity for Thomson Reuters. I'm having a terrible time today. Okay. Adeshni Naidu has over 20 years of technology experience, including time as a CIO of RMB Corporate Bank and the head of electronic banking for Barclays Africa. Since 2017, she served as the CTO of Wave Financial, where she helped the company transform from financial services software organization for small businesses to a software-powered bank for small businesses. She led the engineering and data science functions at Wave through to acquisition by H&R Block in 2019 as Canada's 7th largest tech exit since 2001. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn the table over to you. Let me see if I know how to do that. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing yours. And while
Thank you, Wendy.
Oh, great. Okay.
Good day, ladies, and thank you so much for the privilege of your time and your attention on this incredibly important topic. As we look around our world, increasingly, we are running on AI services. It exists everywhere that we turn. And as the state transitions from pervasive to ubiquitous, an important question arises. What will this mean for society? We play a pivotal role as technologists in this unique time to use this powerful technology to shape the world as we want it to be, to shape a better world. So there's another important question that arises. How are we going to do this? Well, we start by committing the time and the energy that's required to deeply understand the implications of this powerful technology and to use that knowledge to guide it into ethical use. It is a truism that technology is neither good nor evil by itself. It's all in how people use it. The technology that is used to afford people security and privacy under repressive government regimes can also be used to conduct illegal transactions. The knowledge that scientists use to fight epidemics can also be used to create biological weapons. And this story is true all throughout history, perhaps back to what is arguably the world's first technology, fire. In ancient times, just as in modern times, fire can be used to cook food, to purify water, to cauterize a wound, but it can also be used to burn down a village. But there is a distinct difference between the technologies of antiquity or even of modern history, recent history, and what we're seeing happening in the present day. And that is an unprecedented rate of change. We're living in a time and an age in which the rate at which new technologies are coming to life, new applications of technology, whether for good or for ill, are so rapid that people and governments can't keep up with this rate of change and discover the right ways to protect society. It is in the face of this flywheel of unstoppable momentum that we wear a very weighty cloak of responsibility to use this powerful technology to build a world that we want to live in, one that we are comfortable with children inheriting, one that we will not be ashamed to have our names associated with. So back to my question again, how are we going to do this? AI ethics is a really big challenge. It's incredibly complex. Just thinking about the depth and breadth of its scope can be incredibly daunting. But just like the story of the little girl standing on the seashore and tossing one beach starfish at a time back into the ocean, any small difference that you make on any initiative, regardless of its size, will add up and we will turn the tide. In my talk today, I'm going to cover just 3 big challenges in this broad subject of AI ethics. Stories of where good and well-meaning AI can go horribly wrong and create catastrophic effects. Those 3 topics that I'm going to be touching on today are feedback loops, bias, and disinformation. So let's get stuck in and take a look at that very first topic, feedback loops. In very simple terms, a feedback loop is a system that is designed to improve its performance by learning from its past experience. And this occurs when your algorithm is responsible for the next round of data that the user is going to see. Perhaps the most well-known example of a feedback loop is YouTube's recommendation engine, which is responsible for serving over 2 billion users who consume about 1 billion hours of video every day. And this algorithm is responsible for recommending 70% of the content that is watched. From a business performance perspective, this is an outstanding result. But there was a significant problem. This algorithm led to an out-of-control feedback loop, which in turn led to the New York Times running this article. YouTube has unleashed a conspiracy theory boom. Can it be contained? In this story, the author, Kevin Roose, tells the story of a YouTube star whose video, Conspiracy Theories with Shane Dawson, went viral and racked up a record 30 million views, followed very shortly thereafter by a further 20 million views. In this video, Mr. Dawson tells the story or posits theories about iPhones recording every word spoken by their users, to popular children's TV programs urging children to commit suicide, to the deadly spate of wildfires in California being started by homeowners attempting to commit insurance fraud. At no point in the video does Mr. Dawson present any evidence for his claims. But despite this lack of empirical data to back up these stories, his loyal teenage fan base deeply bought into everything that he was sharing. Now, clearly, the algorithm is not responsible for Mr. Dawson's content. It is merely predicting what content people would like, and then it's finding and recommending that content to them. But here's the rub. These algorithms have incredible power to determine what people even see, or perhaps more importantly, what it is that they don't see. It's very, very unlikely that Mr. Dawson's loyal fan base has seen recommendations for content that would debunk any of his theories or provide alternative perspectives. Now, please bear with me through the next part of my talk. It's going to be a little bit monotonous. It is about a loop after all. You see, us human beings, we're drawn to controversial content. And that means that recommendation engines are increasingly recommending conspiracy theories. And we've also discovered that people who like conspiracy theories generally tend to watch a lot of online videos. Put those two pieces together, and these people are increasingly drawn to YouTube. The more conspiracy theorists watching YouTube, the more conspiracy theory videos get recommended by YouTube and other extremist content. The more extremists watching YouTube, and now here's the really scary part, the more people watching YouTube videos developing extremist views, the more extreme content gets recommended by YouTube. Do you see the toxic out of control spiral? As I said, this is one top performing algorithm. It will do anything in its power to maximize that number that it cares about, that it was designed for. In this particular case, in the case of YouTube's recommendation algorithm, that number that it cares about is the number of hours of video that is watched online. It has enormous but indiscriminate power. It is not judging the content as good or bad. It is merely detecting an interest that already exists and then powerfully reinforcing that interest. In the age before powerful feedback loops from an AI engine, the would-be conspiracy theorist would have had to go out there, search for, find, and curate their own content. And along that journey, they may very well have come across content that could have diverted them off their chosen path. But in the face of 50 million views, lending crowdsourced credibility to these stories, even the mildly curious can be turned into an extremist. But this story is not all doom and gloom. There are some wonderful shining examples that we can point to and we can learn from. Like the story of Evan Astola, the lead machine learning engineer at Meetup, who discovered that men were showing more interest in tech meetups than women. And what this meant that if they had gender in the recommendation algorithm, then the recommendation engine of Meetup would recommend fewer tech meetups to women. This means that women would see and attend fewer tech meetups, and that would mean that the recommendation engine would recommend even fewer tech meetups to women, and so reinforce an existing social imbalance. When Evan and his team discovered this, they made the ethical decision to remove gender from that part of their algorithm, and in so doing, break the cycle. They chose social good over a performance metric. And we can take a leaf out of Evan and his team's book, and we too can make those choices. We can very carefully choose the features that we design into our algorithm. We can be careful about what we include and what we don't include. And we can very carefully monitor the performance of our algorithms and look out for those edge cases that we did not intend. And yes, it is possible that doing all of this might affect the performance of our work. But this is a choice that we should be willing to make. Just as companies today will choose to forego profits in order to only use sustainable products or only work with ethical vendors, so too we need to be the voice for ethical use of algorithms. That brings me to my second topic, bias. Now, although bias is a very broad topic with many, many layers of social and technological complexity, the blame for it is often placed squarely upon the shoulders of biased input data. And yes, biased input data is definitely part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem. MIT researchers Harini Suresh and John Guttau discovered that there are at least 6 places in the machine learning process that can introduce bias. But we're going to briefly touch on 2 of those today. We're going to touch on historical bias and representation bias. So let's get stuck into historical bias. According to the researchers, historical bias is a fundamental structural issue with the very first step of the data generation process. And it can exist regardless of whether you have perfect sampling and perfect feature set selection. If your data set that you're working with is about human beings, then it will contain bias, regardless of whether it's medical data or housing data or sales data. The reason that bias is so pervasive in data about human beings is because bias is so pervasive in human beings. As an example, ProPublica revealed the terrible flaws in the Compass Northpoint predictive policing algorithm. Although this algorithm correctly predicts recidivism, which is the likelihood that a person will go on to commit another crime, it does this accurately 61% of the time, but it has a fatal flaw. Blacks are rated twice as likely to commit another offense, but do not go on to reoffend, and it makes the opposite error. Whites are rated much less likely to commit another crime, but do go on to commit another offense. And let's talk about representation bias. Have you ever wondered how the facial recognition results for darker skins went from 100 times more errors for dark skin recognition versus light skin recognition to the same degree of accuracy in just over a year? That's a pretty rapid rate of change for such a complex algorithm. Well, when the news first broke about how shocking the accuracy results were for facial recognition algorithms for dark skins, a number of people claimed that the reason that this performance was poor is because computers had a hard time distinguishing features in darker skins. It turns out that one of the real causes of the problem was systemic imbalance in popular data sets used to train algorithms of this nature. In simple terms, the developers writing the facial recognition software failed to train and test their algorithms using data sets containing enough dark faces. Yes, I know that this is incredibly upsetting and painful to listen to, but we can learn from this and we can do better. So how do we do that? How do we do better? We start by making sure that when we build algorithms, we choose diverse curated data sets. But I want to caution you that a diverse data set will only offset representation bias. It does not address measurement bias or historical bias. And as I explained to you, data sets about human beings all contain bias. There's no such thing as a deep bias data set. But despite this incredibly hard data challenge, there is public outcry for more transparency and more trustworthy AI. The racial and gender issues inherent in the bias of these algorithms is hurting society, and they're looking to us to do something about it, to turn the situation from less black box and more glass box. But what does that mean for us? How do we make AI trustworthy? Well, we do this by creating explainable AI. And just to be clear, explainable AI doesn't mean an AI that can explain itself. No, what it actually is an explicit design decision that is made by a developer, by people like us who build algorithms. We make an explicit decision to build explainability into the entire design process. And we start this by understanding what explanations will be needed. And we discover that by talking to the people who will require those explanations, like the end users of our algorithms, like the regulators and government bodies. We also need to invest the effort to produce interim and intermediate results all through the training process so that it can become part of the explanation. And yes, it's possible that by making these changes, it will impact the performance of the algorithm. But here again, this is a trade-off we should be willing to make in order to create safe and trustworthy AI. And that brings me to my final topic, disinformation. Disinformation, like bias, has a long, long history, and it has been used to sow disharmony, discord, and uncertainty, and get people to give up on seeking the truth. In short, it is propaganda. Many of us think of disinformation as being fake news or false information, but in reality, disinformation often contains genuine seeds of truth alongside of half-truths that have been taken out of context. That's what makes it so powerful and so dangerous. It can turn even the discerning mind off the scent of the real truth. The story that's referenced in this article run by the New York Times of the disinformation campaign run by Bell Pottinger in South Africa brings up particularly painful memories for me. I remember this time in my country's history. I remember the riots that rocked my country. Bell Pottinger played on my country's painful racial history and stirred up racial tension to heights that we had not seen since apartheid, and nearly brought the country to the brink of civil war. And even though many of the miscreants behind this particular campaign have been brought to justice, the repercussions of their actions are still being felt in South Africa today with no real end in sight. Increasingly, radicalized what does that mean for us? Does that mean we should trust no one? We should distrust everything? That's not the answer either. We do need to trust, but we need to trust and verify. And that means we need to be willing to do the homework, to verify the sources of the information that we are looking up and hearing about, to look broadly across more than just our in-groups so we can see multiple perspectives, to make sure that we understand the implications of the information that we are consuming before we buy them. But here again, researchers are trying to make things easier for us in the form of analysis and research into digital signatures that can allow us to very quickly and very easily authenticate where a piece of information has come from. Now, ladies, that brings me to the end of my talk. But if I have sparked in you any interest and excitement in this topic of AI ethics and any desire to join the fight, then I ask you to come and join me at Thomson Reuters, where it is our desire to become a significant force for changing this for the world. And back to you, Wendy.
Actually, it gets to be back to me It's Adele Newton here. Thank you, Ideshni, for this really important and thought-provoking talk, especially in the last 18 months. We've seen some of the results of what's happened with disinformation and speaker and bias, etc. So I think it's really important that what you talked about was really important and really relevant, and especially I was especially taken by the piece about Bell Pottinger and the ongoing repercussions of something that happened. It's not just what happens in the moment, but it keeps going and keeps reinforcing people's biases. So thank you so much for that thought-provoking talk. I'll ask anyone who has any questions for Ideshni to put them in the Q&A, but in the meantime, Ideshni and I are going to have a little conversation about you and your journey and what you've done. So I'm curious, what or who inspired you to pursue studies in computer science and what you're doing now, which seems like more than just computer science, actually. There's certainly a social piece to it.
Well, Adele, I'm going to show my age a little bit in answering your question here. A school teacher introduced all the kids in my school that were good at math to computer science. And I loved it immediately. It invoked in me a sense of wonder, a sense of this is something that has infinite possibilities. And the truth is, I still feel that today. But back then, people didn't understand the subject of computer science. This is the part where I'm dating myself. People didn't understand the subject of computer science, and they didn't know what kind of career I could have. And so there was a lot of social pressure from my community and my extended family to go in a different direction, to not pick this subject. But to my dad's credit, he saw the spark of love and interest I had in this subject. And so he supported my decision, even though he didn't understand it either. And he took it upon himself to face the social pressure of my community and his family and his peer group, who all thought this was a bad idea. At that time, they believed that if you've got a smart kid, they should be studying medicine or law or accounting. So this was really off the beaten path. So that's how I ended up going down this track.
What do you think?
The courage of my father.
What do you think you would have done if your father had been there to support you?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I have thought about that over the years, and it's very likely that I would have gone down the track of mathematics and ended up doing something in the area of statistics.
Well, thank goodness for your teacher. And I've had these conversations over the last year with a lot of people, and so many people have had teachers as the people who inspired them. So I think that says something really about communities and teachers and your parents as well. So what are 3 traits that you think that you believe led to your trajectory, your growth trajectory? 3 traits that you have.
Well, Adele, growing up in South Africa, the challenges that I had to face were the discrimination around my race, my gender, my economic background. The list kind of went on and on. So very early on, I learned to be gritty, to persevere when there were challenges and to not give up. And that ability to keep persevering against the odds and against where people are assuming that a problem or a challenge or an obstacle cannot be overcome, became a trademark of mine. And as I carried that trait into the workplace, it quickly gave me a reputation for being this person who can solve hard problems. So people would bring projects to me that other people had actually rejected because they thought this is too hard or this is impossible. And then I'd get results. And as a consequence of that, it impacted my ability to be incredibly successful through my career. So the very first trait I would say is grittiness, that tenacity and perseverance. There's a quote I want to share with you, which is one of my life favorites, and that is, it's from Nelson Mandela. And the quote is a really short one. It says, it always seems impossible until it is done. The second thing that I would say is an important trait is compassion. Being other person centered and focusing deeply on understanding where people are coming from, and developing an empathy for their truth. going back to what I was saying around the intense discrimination that has been a big part of my life story, early on, I had realized that I needed to understand where people were coming from if I was going to work through this. If I could find compassion for their truth, I could find a way to work with them regardless of how they were treating me. And the best way that I can think of to share this piece with you is when I first started working, I worked for De Beers, which is one of the world's largest diamond companies, but I worked in the research lab. And one of my peers, one of my colleagues, walked into the lab one day, took one look at me and said, I refuse to work in a lab where there's a woman present. Turn around and walk right out. And my manager came up to me to apologize for his behavior. But this was in the early days of South Africa's racial integration. We were just starting to intermingle races in the workplace. And I knew that he was making the comment about my gender, but his real issue with me was my skin color. And my boss said to me, don't worry about it, I'll deal with it and I'll speak to him. And I asked my boss not to do that. Because if he was going to go and reprimand this colleague of mine, this person would end up hating and disliking people of color even more. So I asked him to please let me deal with it in my way. And over the time I spent working with this colleague, he was a very seasoned engineer, so I learned a lot from him. I worked hard, I listened carefully to him, I treated him with great respect, regardless of how he behaved. And by the time I left that organization, he was heartbroken. He had a radical change of heart about what people of color can actually mean and what value they can bring. And that's the power we all have to change people's hearts. People do not hate, discriminate, and reject from a place of peace and courage and self-love. They do it from a place of fear and pain. And if we can find in ourselves the empathy for that fear and that pain, we can affect lasting change. So compassion would be the second trait. And then the third one I would say is to be a change agent, to be the change in the world that we want to see. And for me personally, I wanted to be treated with trust and with respect. I wanted people to treat me with dignity, regardless of my gender and my color or the poor community that I came from. I wanted them to see me as somebody who had value just inherently in who I was. And because that's what I wanted, I started treating everybody else like that. And again, this is back to how we create lasting change.
So I have to ask you, I know that you've described the incredible difficulty of having to deal with race and gender discrimination and growing up in South Africa, especially just as apartheid ended and integration was coming. Are you ever grateful for having had that experience in terms of what it taught you?
That's a wonderful question, Adele. And yes, I actually am. It's shaped who I am today. And I know that I've been able to impact many lives as a consequence of having gone through that experience. And I won't tell you that it was easy and I just did it. That's not the case at all. It was hard. It was painful. And there were many times when it was kind of easy to say, I'm going to give it.
Oh dear.
But there was this other side that says that, well, that's not going to make anything better. And the more I leaned into the compassion, the more I started seeing people as they're in pain, they're feeling fear. And if I can just understand that I also feel pain and fear, that human connection is enough for me to build a bridge. And as I went through those experiences in South Africa, they shaped what kind of leader I became. They shaped what kind of co-worker I became. And that created for me, I think, the foundation stones for a very successful career.
Yeah, sometimes not coming from a place of privilege actually gives you more to work with in terms of understanding where other people might be coming from. So thank you for answering that honestly. I know it's not an easy question, so I appreciate that. What do you consider to have been some of your most challenging experiences or even failures to date professionally?
Well, some years ago, I was approached for an opportunity with a large telco, a large telecommunications company, a multinational corporation operating across Africa, to be the chief customer experience officer. And what I would be responsible for is all of the digital and the physical channels for this entity. And it seemed like an amazing opportunity because at that point in my career, I'd spent over a decade in the banks building electronic banking. So I had lots of experience with digital channels, and I thought this is a great opportunity to expand and also learn about physical channels. With hindsight, that decision was just sheer hubris on my part. I went into the job and then discovered how unsuited I was to the role. And as I got into the job, I realized that in the course of my assessment, I didn't take enough time to do the homework. I looked at the role and I got, in some ways, blinded by the excitement of the opportunity and built up that image in my head of what it would be. And I blinded myself to the risks. That, and there were some falsehoods in the recruitment process, so the job wasn't exactly what it was promised to be. But having said all of that, I stayed in the job, even though on day one, I learned that it wasn't quite what was promised to me, and I got it done. But I paid a terrible price. It significantly impacted my health. And even to this day, there are still some lingering health challenges that I need to continue to deal with as a consequence of that decision. But it taught me a lot about myself, some hard truths about myself, who I am and what I'm not. I am a peacetime general, not a wartime general. There are specific things that I can do well. And even though you can get something done, doesn't mean that you should do it. I've learned to be a lot more thoughtful about evaluating both what I do bring to a role and what I don't bring, and understanding for myself what's going to give me energy and what's going to tear down my energy. So painful, hard lesson, and a place to look in the mirror and see things about myself that I'm not proud of, but a good opportunity to learn about all the sides of my own personality.
It's so important to understand when is time to leave and time to stay. And not everyone sometimes has the courage to leave or to understand that it's the wrong fit. And you see that more and more with burnout. And I think we're learning that even as people have been working through COVID, that they've made those difficult decisions. But you're right, it's very important for your health. And that's a huge piece of it. And so speaking of that, I wanted to ask you, and this may be related, how do you deal with moments of self-doubt, and how do you deal with your inner critic? Is that something that's related perhaps to this life lesson that you learned with that particular job?
And I've got two different plans for this. One of the plans has come up much more recently. The first one is to go to the people who are in my circle of trust, people I have a tremendous amount of respect for and whose wisdom I really trust, and to share with them whatever it is that I'm going through. Well, what is that inner critic yelling at me? What situation am I in? And to do my very best to represent the situation honestly. And what that often means is to go to that vulnerable place where you disclose to your circle of trust something you did that you're not proud of, something you said you're not proud of, something you're thinking that you're not proud of, so that they can see the full picture in order to give you some guidance and advice. And what's always beautiful about that is having the benefit of a circle of friends or an accountability circle that are willing to say hard things to you, no matter how hard it is for them to say, and no matter how hard they know it's going to be for you to hear. And then being willing to hear, being open to the truth. These people are here because they care. They're telling you the truth because they care, and then being willing to let it in and hear it. I would also go so far as to ask them to hold me accountable to whatever it is I'm learning through this experience, to take that learning into my life and to apply it. So that's my first strategy. And the second one, and this is one that I've only developed very recently, is a system of self-talk. I noticed something about myself, that when my inner critic is yelling, what I'm getting for myself is judgment and frustration. But when I'm talking to someone else, if somebody else is coming to me with a problem, then I've got wisdom and I've got compassion. So it looks to me that I've got two different voices, one for others and one for myself. So when I do the self-talk, I imagine that I am talking to myself, but this person happens to be a good friend of mine that I care about. And what advice would I give her? And if I can do that, then I can channel that side of me that is more compassionate and more patient and has more wisdom to share and less of the judgment. And therefore I can see the situation with much more clarity.
I think that's such wise advice, because whether we know it or not, we all have, I've heard it called the obnoxious roommate in our head, the inner critic. And being able to say, no, you can't talk to my friend that way is something really important. So I think that's really good advice and wisdom for all of us, and especially the younger women in the audience who may not have had the experience of that. You know, those of us who are betraying our age have had to talk about that. We have a couple of questions about your talk that I want to get to. The first one is, are there any paths other than explainable AI to facilitate fair AI?
So right now, as an example, there's quite a lot of work that's going on where several researchers are looking at techniques where you can detect bias in an algorithm. So as an example, if you start taking a look at the results of an algorithm and what distribution of outcome it's producing, and then you watch that same algorithm over a period of time to see if there's a deterioration, if there's a change. So if, for example, there's a certain percentage of women or people of color that are being granted home loans, you test the algorithm and you are comfortable that it's producing the right results, then you watch it over a period of time and see, does that ratio remain roughly the same? And if the ratio starts to change, you detect that there's a potential degradation in the algorithm's performance, and you go in and you take a look and you see what happened here that we did not expect. So there are quite a few techniques that are being researched at the moment where there's ways to look at an algorithm after it's been deployed as well, to continually check if it's performing in a way that handles these different bias scenarios.
Thank you. This is an interesting one, especially during these times of misinformation. How can we combat accusations of censorship and government overreach in this day and age, where many topics, involving tech, data management, etc., especially those that are not fully understood by the general population, are so polarizing?
Well, you know, what a beautiful question. I'm going to use my South African history again here. In South Africa, very early in the days of reconciliation and bringing the country together, we set up the TRC, something that you know about in Canada as well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to have a place where we can speak openly about the very hardest things, to talk about the grave injustices that have been committed. If we aren't able to speak openly about the things that are damaging to society, we actually can't heal the wounds. The worst thing that we can do is to cover up, or pretend something didn't happen, or pretend that we aren't all involved in the outcome of how this moves forward. So the first thing that I would say is we've got to be committed to open dialogue. As these different issues come up, it is polarizing. And when something is polarizing, we tend to choose to go quiet. How many times have we had that phrase, don't bring up politics or religion at the dinner table? Why? Because it will polarize. But again, the voice of compassion, the desire to listen to each other, to deeply understand each other's perspectives. If someone is on the other side of the spectrum of belief from you, all the more reason to seek to understand why. Help me understand why you believe what you do. Help me understand why your beliefs are so fundamental to your life and so fundamentally important to what's going on with you. The more we can seek to understand each other, the more we can close the gaps that separate us.
So again, it comes down to what you talked about, empathy and understanding other people, and instead of censorship. And so your example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is actually quite powerful, because that's such a strong example of where people really did come together. And it's not perfect, obviously, in South Africa, but I know that it was a huge journey for people to come together. So it's a great role model, or great thing to look at as we struggle through this today, I think. So thank you for that.
And I have to say that, you know, one of the things I noticed as being different, you know, coming from South Africa, I moved from Johannesburg to Toronto 4 years ago, is I see a difference. You know, there's more politeness, which I appreciate and love about Canadian culture, but there's less willingness to go to the hard topics and talk about it. And I know where it's coming from. It's coming from a place of care. We don't want to say something hurtful. We don't want to do something hurtful. But at the same time, it becomes a missed opportunity to understand. If you're going to say something respectfully, if you're going to truly seek to understand, if you're going to open that conversation with a desire to come together, to not let the empty space between us, the silence between us, keep us separated from one another. It takes a lot of courage, and it's very scary, but it's so worthwhile to walk that journey.
Well, thank you. I have one other question here. Your Meetup example is so intriguing. If Meetup was recommending fewer meetings to females, that was based on fewer female identifying users or fewer events labeled suitable for females. Is that correct? In your opinion, what AI error is happening here?
So let me restate what was going on with the Meetup engine. What they had discovered in the overall data set, remember that the algorithms themselves don't actually truly understand what a gender is, right? It's only a parameter to an algorithm. They don't understand male or female. This is a piece of AI. They're looking at the data set, and in the data set, men have expressed, or the data itself tells them men have more interest in tech meetups. So from an algorithm point of view, an optimal outcome is to recommend more tech meetups to men because that's what they're more interested in. And in contrast, data contrast, remember that, right? The numbers indicate that women have a lower interest in tech meetups. So if the algorithm is trying to optimize for what it sees as a woman's interest, it's going to recommend less tech meetups to women. So if you think about what's happening there as a pattern, women are going to see less tech meetups. And if they're already responding with a lower rate of interest to tech meetups, that will drop even further. So the problem gets reinforced. The systemic imbalance gets stronger. If you take gender out of the equation, then the algorithm can't distinguish. And as a result of that, it will show the same number of tech meetups to men and to women, and it will choose other parameters to determine the set of interests. So that particular issue that I described, there's lots of examples of that. I'll give you another one. In the role of surgeons, now there's a systemic imbalance worldwide in terms of the representation of women surgeons versus male surgeons. And because of this, the algorithm that does recruitment, so basically an algorithm that puts job profiles out for new roles that are open, the algorithm looks at the data. Again, gender is not a real concept, it's a feature in an algorithm. It sees that there are far fewer women, which from an algorithm's perspective means that if you target this job profile to women, it's a much smaller pool to fish from. So the likelihood that you'll match the role and you'll get candidates is lower. So it does the math and sends the role off to the men.
Right.
Right? So you can see how the math does the calculation and drops the woman out of the pool.
Right. So it's not that it's just simply another box to tick, and with fewer numbers, it just doesn't go there. Yeah.
Right. And if you take all the labels off and you just do the mathematics, you can see that the algorithm is working in an efficient fashion.
Mm-hmm.
But this is something that we need to worry about because systemic imbalance in society already exists. The data is already biased. So the data is feeding the bias into the algorithm, and the algorithm will exacerbate the bias.
It's a really interesting example, and I think the surgeon example is even more fascinating because it all of this affects us without necessarily even meaning to, I think is what you're saying. So it's
right.
Just, yeah.
So the algorithm is running the job profiles out there for a new job post for a surgeon. Fewer and fewer women are seeing the posts. So what's the interpretation from the human being advertising the job? They think, oh, there's fewer women interested in this job.
Right.
Yeah.
I really want to thank you for everything, but I want to leave you with one last question that's really important for our audience. What advice would you give the young women in the audience about choosing a career, understanding that most of them are studying computer science right now?
I think, again, I go back to something that I said. I feel such a sense of wonder when it comes to technology. It turns me every day into a big kid because I feel the magic of what we can do with technology and all the power it has to truly create a wonderful world, a world in which we can spread the goodness widely and deeply. I believe that. I truly believe in that as the power of technology. But we need lots of people believing that and being willing to make the world better using the power of technology. So I'm going to very selfishly urge all of these young women to go into technology and to use its power to shape a better world. Earlier today, I mentioned the 3 traits that have served me well: grit, being compassionate, and being a change agent. And I would ask you, please take that with you. You can add everything else that you think is relevant for you from your own life experience, but I think that those 3 are going to be very powerful. And then I'll add one last bit. Being a part of a network of women supporting women. This is something so important. Give each other the joy and the benefit of honest, compassionate, and actionable feedback. We don't grow in the soft places, we grow in the hard places. But we're going to be willing to tell each other the hard truths. This is something that I teach all of my leaders, all of my managers over the course of my career, is if you hold back giving somebody feedback on their performance, the choice you're making is to spare their feelings and hurt their lives. You've got to choose differently. And that's what I'm going to urge all of these young women to do. Give each other honest, compassionate, actionable feedback. You can say anything to someone, no matter how hard, as long as you're doing it from a place of compassion and respect. You can leave their dignity fully intact, and they will be able to absorb what it is you're trying to do to help them to grow. As a really simple example I want to use to contrast this. A sports coach will never hesitate to tell their sportsmen and women what's wrong with the way in which they're doing something. If that swing is going to hurt their shoulder, no hesitation. If they're 1 degree off on their performance, no hesitation, because that's the best way to make them the best performing athlete. That's the same way we need to look at how we give each other feedback. So all throughout this situation, you're a network. You're a network of women who can support women, and the combined capability is what's going to make a difference.
That's really wonderful advice. And I want to thank you so much for your time and for this. We've had a lot of comments in the chat about what a great talk it is. Wendy, I'm going to ask you to come back on and just lead us end this session and move on to the next. Thank you, Deshni. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.